I'm Aubrey Lawson. I'm 34 years old, and a week ago my father threatened to erase me from his will because I refused to play along in a family photo I never agreed to be in. He wasn't screaming when he said it. His voice was calm, almost bored, as if he was moving numbers around on a spreadsheet, not talking about his oldest child. He told me my job was simple: fly home, stand beside my little sister at her wedding, smile on cue so the pictures would show a perfect family. Then, according to him, everyone could forget the awkward fact that I left, that I raised my daughter alone, that I built a life in another state without their help. The funny part is that he didn't even realize I'd moved. I'd been gone for over a year before he noticed the address on one of my emails. For 12 months, he hadn't asked where I lived, how far I was from them, or what it took to get there. I was just a name on a holiday group text, a background detail he could pull in when it suited the story he wanted to tell. So when he tried to use money to drag me back into that story, to threaten me with a future inheritance he assumed I needed, something in me snapped. Because what he doesn't know yet is that I'm not the one who should be afraid of losing everything. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now? And where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. Time has a strange way of stretching when you grow up feeling like a background character in your own house. I learned early that the Lawson family ran on a hierarchy everyone pretended didn't exist. At the top sat my father's approval, a prize reserved almost exclusively for my younger sister Marissa. Even as kids, she was the one with the framed certificates lining the hallway, the girl who got applause for ordinary things. I was the one who blended into doorways, expected to be grateful for existing quietly. My mother, Elaine, never said outright that Marissa was easier to love, but she didn't need to. She had a talent for soft praise delivered in one direction. If I came home with good grades, she'd offer a polite nod. If Marissa earned the same, the kitchen turned into a celebration. I built a habit of shrinking myself just to keep the peace. By the time I left for college, distance felt like oxygen. I thought adulthood would soften the dynamic, or at least make it easier to ignore. Instead, things became more complicated when I found out I was pregnant. The baby's father stepped out of the picture before I could blink, leaving me alone with a decision I didn't hesitate to make. I wanted my child, even if I'd be raising her on my own. Telling my parents didn't go the way I'd hoped. My father, Gregory Lawson, didn't yell. He simply tightened his jaw and asked if I'd thought through the consequences. He didn't mean the responsibility. He meant the optics. My mother sighed the way she did when a glass left a ring on the table. Neither asked how I felt or whether I had support. What struck me hardest was the absence of curiosity about the life growing inside me. It was as if she wasn't a person yet, just a variable in a narrative they didn't approve of. When my daughter was born, everything sharpened. I named her Mila, and holding her shifted something permanent inside me. She deserved a world that didn't ask her to apologize for existing. I tried giving my parents a chance to be part of her life, but every visit felt like an evaluation. They commented on how tired I looked, how busy Marissa was with her career, how unexpected responsibilities changed people. Mila was treated politely, almost formally, never embraced the way grandparents usually behave around a first grandchild. A few years later, I was offered a position in Denver. Better pay, remote options, stability I'd earned without asking anyone for anything. Accepting meant leaving Oklahoma, and the clarity that brought surprised me. I told my parents out of courtesy. They nodded, asked what month I planned to move, and nothing more. They didn't ask for the address. They didn't ask how Mila felt about leaving. They didn't even ask why Denver. It became obvious their interest had limits, and my life fell outside them. Denver, however, welcomed us quietly. I set up an apartment for Mila and me, started a new routine, and began building a life that didn't revolve around family expectations. Weeks turned into months. Holidays passed. My parents sent group texts with smiling photos from dinners we weren't invited to. A birthday card for Mila arrived addressed to our old place in Tulsa, forwarded by a kind neighbor who realized we hadn't lived there in almost a year. It was proof, in a small way, that we'd disappeared from my parents' radar long before I physically left. One afternoon, after picking Mila up from school, I opened the mailbox and noticed an oversized envelope with elegant lettering. Inside was an invitation printed on thick ivory paper, an announcement that Marissa was engaged, and a request for close family to attend a dinner in her honor. The postmark told me everything. It had been sent to my former address first, then forwarded again, losing 2 weeks in transit. My parents hadn't bothered checking where I lived before sending something meant to feel personal. Mila saw the envelope in my hand and her eyes lit up. She asked whether this meant she'd get to see her grandparents, whether they'd remember her favorite stories, whether Oklahoma still had the big parks she played in as a toddler. Her excitement came so naturally, untouched by the history I carried. Watching her bounce around the kitchen with that invitation made the distance between my childhood and hers feel sharper than ever. And for the first time in a long while, I wondered what returning, briefly, cautiously, might reveal about the people I'd tried for years to understand. The flight to Oklahoma passed in a quiet blur, and by the time we landed, Mila was awake and buzzing with an excitement I didn't have the heart to dim. She gripped my hand tightly as we walked through the small airport, chattering about the dress she had picked and the card she had drawn for my sister. I tried to match her energy, but the closer we got to Tulsa, the heavier the air felt. Driving toward my parents' neighborhood stirred a familiar tension in my chest. The streets looked the same, but the house stood out in a way it never had before. Larger, louder, polished for an occasion. Cars lined the driveway, and decorations covered the front lawn, as if the entire block needed to know there was a celebration happening inside. Mila stared in awe, holding her card with both hands, determined not to bend the edges. The moment we stepped through the door, the noise swallowed us. Music played, people laughed, and the living room brimmed with faces I barely recognized. In the center of it all was my father, Gregory Lawson, smiling as if he were hosting a gala rather than a family gathering. He looked up, acknowledged me with a curt nod, then returned to the cluster around him. My mother, Elaine Lawson, approached a moment later with the kind of polite warmth reserved for acquaintances. She offered a brief comment about how Mila had grown and moved on before I could answer. Marissa Lawson appeared soon after, radiant in a fitted white dress meant to draw eyes. Her hair was styled perfectly, her makeup flawless, every inch of her curated for admiration. Mila stepped forward shyly, clutching her card and holding it out with a hopeful smile. Marissa accepted it with a practiced expression, glanced at the front, murmured something polite, and set it on a side table already cluttered with unopened gifts. Mila didn't seem to notice, but I did. As the evening unfolded, I realized how invisibly we blended into the background. Guests greeted my parents, praised their hosting, admired Marissa's ring, commented on the decor. Very few acknowledged Mila, and even fewer addressed me directly. Conversations flowed around us like we were temporary fixtures, not family members returning after years away. Mila didn't complain, but she stayed close, her excitement dimming slowly as she watched the spotlight settle firmly on her aunt. When the photographer arrived, the energy in the room shifted. People straightened their clothes, lipstick was reapplied, and my father guided Marissa and her fiancé toward a designated area decorated with shimmering backdrops. The photographer lifted the camera and called for immediate family. My father positioned himself on one side of Marissa, my mother on the other. Guests moved aside automatically. Mila tugged my sleeve, whispering that we should go join them. I took a step forward with her, unsure of whether to assume we were included, when my father lifted a hand sharply. His voice carried over the room, firm and composed. He didn't raise the volume, but the tone cut clean through the chatter. He told me the first round of pictures needed to be simple and focused, and gestured subtly for Mila and me to wait off to the side. The photographer hesitated only a moment before lifting the camera again, capturing the posed trio without us. Mila froze beside me, her smile faltering. She didn't cry, didn't ask questions, didn't tug my hand this time. She just stood there, staring at the camera as flashes lit up faces she desperately wanted to be part of. The card she had made for Marissa remained untouched on the crowded table, its glittering edges dulled under the dim lights. Another series of poses followed. My parents adjusted their posture, Marissa shifted her bouquet between hands, the photographer praised their angles. No one acknowledged the two of us waiting a few feet away. The guests nearby didn't seem to notice our absence from the frame, absorbed in their own conversations. I watched Mila lower her gaze to the floor, her shoulders drawing inward, the excitement she'd carried from Denver slipping away piece by piece. Something in her small, quiet stillness weighed heavier than any words could. And in that crowded room full of celebration, it became painfully clear how easy it was for this family to overlook the people who didn't fit the image they wanted to project. I stepped away from the crowd for a moment, hoping a little distance would steady the knot tightening in my chest. The hallway outside the living room was quieter, the music muffled behind the walls. Mila needed a moment to breathe, and truthfully, so did I. She had wandered toward the den where a few kids played with party favors, trying to pretend her disappointment didn't sting. I let her go, giving her space to recover without the weight of adult eyes on her. As I turned the corner toward the kitchen, familiar voices filtered through the slight gap of the door. My father's tone was unmistakable. Measured, authoritative, the same voice he used during business meetings when he wanted to impress someone. Curiosity tugged at me, not because I expected affection, but because I recognized the cadence he used when he discussed subjects he cared about more than people. Through the doorway, I saw him standing beside a man in a tailored suit, someone clearly important enough to warrant my father's best performance. They spoke near a display showcasing the Lawson Scholars Fund, a polished presentation board surrounded by pamphlets and framed photos of students receiving scholarships. I lingered in the shadow of the hallway, unseen. My father gestured toward one of the photos, describing their most recent fundraising goals with a pride I'd never heard directed at any of his children. The man nodded along, asking a quiet question I couldn't quite catch. My father's answer came clearly, each word scraping against something raw inside me. He spoke about preserving the family's image for the sake of the fund's credibility, about maintaining a public narrative that made donors feel confident in the Lawsons as reliable pillars of the community. Then the conversation shifted in a way that made my hands go cold. He mentioned Marissa's engagement and how it presented a perfect opportunity to reinforce that narrative. He referenced her curated persona, her professional trajectory, her upcoming wedding, all as assets to the fund's reputation. When the man asked whether all of his children would be participating in the events surrounding the wedding, my father's response was delivered with the same measured tone he'd always used when dismissing inconvenient details. He said I tended to complicate the picture, that my life choices didn't align with the story he wanted to present, and that my daughter was sweet but distracting. Hearing him categorize Mila that way, reducing her to an obstacle, hit harder than I expected. It was the kind of cruelty that didn't require raised voices. Casual, composed, and practiced. I reached into my pocket slowly, feeling my phone with a clarity that bordered on instinct. The recording feature started with a soft, almost imperceptible tap. I didn't need much, just enough. A few seconds later, my father repeated the sentiment, affirming that some members of the family fit the image better than others. The words were coded with confidence, as though he believed they were harmless truths spoken among equals. The man beside him didn't disagree. That part didn't surprise me. People rarely contradicted Gregory Lawson when he spoke with that tone. I slipped away before anyone noticed me, moving toward the den where Mila sat cross-legged on the floor, watching a group of children build a small tower of plastic cups. She looked up briefly when I entered, her eyes searching mine for something. I gave her a small smile, enough to reassure her without pretending everything was fine. She returned it weakly, then turned back to the game forming in front of her. Nearby, a decorated table displayed pamphlets for the scholarship fund, each one polished to match the staged perfection my father valued so much. A familiar logo on the front caught my attention, the same one I remembered from a set of financial reports I'd analyzed months earlier during a freelance project. I hadn't looked at those documents with any sense of connection at the time, but standing there now, I saw the alignment too clearly. Names, dates, transfers. Small irregularities that didn't seem especially significant then. I felt the weight of two realities colliding. The father who claimed he cared about legacy, and the man who used people, family included, to secure it. The air felt heavier with the realization, and though no one in that room would have guessed it, something inside me shifted. Mila gathered the stack of cups carefully, determined not to let them fall. I watched her focus, the gentleness in her movements, the innocence she still carried. It struck me how she deserved better than the version of family she'd witnessed that evening. And as the noise of the party resumed around us, the distance between who my father pretended to be and who he truly was settled into a clarity I could no longer ignore. Back at the hotel that night, the quiet felt almost unnatural after the noise of the party. Mila fell asleep within minutes, curled on the far side of the bed with her favorite blanket tucked under her chin. I sat at the small desk beneath the dim lamp and opened my laptop, letting the glow spill over the pages of pamphlets I'd gathered earlier. The logo of the Lawson Scholars Fund stared back at me, crisp and polished, pretending to represent something noble. I typed slowly at first, trying to remember the sequence of events from the freelance project I'd taken on months earlier. The accounting firm in Denver had hired me to review batches of data. Nothing unusual, mostly routine reconciliations. But buried among those files had been a string of transactions tied to a familiar account name. At the time, I'd assumed it was coincidence. Now, with the memory of my father's words echoing in my head, coincidence no longer made sense. I searched my archived folders until I found the spreadsheets. A series of transfers appeared in neat rows, payments leaving the scholarship fund and landing in an account registered under Gregory Lawson. The notes attached to the transfers were vague. Event supplies, administrative reimbursement, program support. None of the amounts were massive individually, but over time they formed a pattern that didn't match what a charity should spend on. The dates aligned strangely well with the upgrades I'd seen in my parents' home and the timeline Marissa had casually shared about her wedding planning. I scrolled through the entries again, heart pounding harder with each line. The more I looked, the clearer the story became. While donors believed they were supporting students, my father appeared to be redirecting money toward his own family's image. It was a theft disguised as leadership, hidden behind the trust people placed in his role. My hands shook slightly as I compiled the relevant files into a single folder labeled plainly with the fund's name. I didn't need every detail, just enough to confirm the pattern. Once the documents were organized, I drafted a message to Riley Shaw, the attorney I'd worked with years ago. She had always been steady, pragmatic, and impossible to intimidate. If anyone could help me make sense of this without letting emotion cloud the facts, it was her. I attached the spreadsheets, added a short explanation, and hesitated for only a second before hitting send. The reply came faster than I expected. Riley's tone was calm as always, but her message held none of the uncertainty I felt. She explained that the financial trail looked suspicious, potentially falling under misappropriation of charitable funds. She asked for additional context, and I provided a concise summary of what I'd overheard that night, along with the recording I had captured. When she responded again, her assessment was decisive. This wasn't just concerning, it was actionable. I closed the laptop just as my phone buzzed on the desk. My father's name lit up the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it ring, but silence felt too much like permission. I answered. His voice came through steady, controlled, as if what happened earlier at the party had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He didn't ask how the trip was going, or whether Mila was asleep. Instead, he moved directly into expectations. He said Marissa's wedding required commitment from the entire family, and he wanted me to stay in Tulsa until the ceremony. He insisted that appearances mattered, that unity mattered, that I had a responsibility not to jeopardize the image he'd spent years cultivating. The words washed over me without landing, until he added the part he wanted to hurt. If I chose not to support the family at this critical moment, he said he would have no choice but to reevaluate his estate plans. He made it sound reasonable, almost administrative, as though revising his will was not punishment but practicality. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the familiar rush of guilt or fear he usually triggered. Instead, a strange clarity settled over me. My father believed I still needed what he held over my head. He believed the prospect of losing an inheritance would tether me to the choice he wanted me to make. What he didn't understand, what he'd never cared to learn, was that my life in Denver, the one he pretended didn't exist, was stable in ways he couldn't influence. When the call ended, I sat in the stillness of the room, listening to Mila's quiet breathing. The weight of the file on my laptop was suddenly heavier than anything he'd threatened. For years, he'd used control to shape the family's narrative. Now I held something that told a different story, one he couldn't manipulate or polish. I closed the laptop slowly, not because I doubted what I'd found, but because I finally understood the shift taking place. My father might believe his image was unbreakable, but the truth had a way of moving quietly through the cracks. Morning came slowly, stretching across the hotel curtains in thin lines of pale light. Mila was still asleep, curled beneath the covers with one arm wrapped around her blanket, unaware of the storm building just beyond the quiet room. I moved carefully so I wouldn't wake her and sat at the desk again, scrolling through Riley's latest message. She had requested permission to contact a compliance officer she trusted, someone who could review the financial trail discreetly before anything formal was filed. Her caution wasn't hesitation, it was methodical. It was the kind of careful strategy my father could never claim to use for anything other than appearances. I typed my approval and sent the message, the decision settling over me like an anchor. I didn't feel relief, not yet, but there was a strange steadiness in knowing that the truth was finally in motion. A soft knock at the door shattered the moment. It wasn't housekeeping. The rhythm was too sharp, too familiar. I opened the door only halfway, expecting a hotel manager or perhaps a delivery I hadn't asked for. Instead, my parents stood in the hallway, side by side, wrapped in an urgency they didn't bother trying to mask. Greg Lawson stepped forward first without waiting for an invitation, brushing past me with the confidence of someone accustomed to crossing boundaries. Elaine Lawson followed, quieter but equally firm, her expression set in a way that told me this wasn't a casual visit. They positioned themselves near the foot of the bed as if staging an intervention, though the only person in need of confronting anything was them. I closed the door gently, glancing at Mila to make sure she remained asleep. My father launched into his reason for being there, his tone carrying the same practiced calm he used in boardrooms. He mentioned the disruption of the previous night, framing it as though I had misunderstood the intentions behind the family photos. He emphasized order, tradition, the flow of events, never acknowledging the way Mila had been pushed aside. To him, feelings were distractions, and distractions were weaknesses. Elaine added a few carefully chosen comments, more concerned with avoiding public embarrassment than addressing any of the harm that had actually been done. She spoke of appearances, of expectations, of the importance of presenting family unity during the engagement and the wedding. Neither asked how Mila felt. Neither asked how I felt. They spoke as though I were an employee who had jeopardized a brand, not a daughter who had endured decades of being placed at the edge of every room. I let them talk until the words became repetitive, hollow. Then I asked them why they had really come. The answer came not through confession, but through the paper folder my father withdrew from his coat. He set it on the desk with deliberate precision. Inside were printed copies of emails. Mine. Correspondence between Riley and me, forwarded to his account. I didn't ask how he obtained them. I already knew. He had always used access like a weapon. He spoke about misinterpretations, about data taken out of context, about the danger of making accusations without understanding the full scope. He tried to create doubt, weaving the same confident narrative he used to charm donors. But the problem was that he assumed the facts were fragile. He assumed I was fragile. I stayed silent as he framed his diversions, letting him reveal more than he realized. He mentioned specific fundraiser expenses I hadn't included in the files sent to Riley. He referenced dates I hadn't cited aloud. He described internal allocations that weren't listed publicly anywhere. The details slipped from him in moments of irritation, each one confirming exactly what he hoped to deny. While he talked, I watched the room shift around him. The certainty he projected had begun to crack at the edges, replaced by a thin urgency. He wasn't protecting a cause. He was protecting himself. Elaine tried a different tactic: soft reasoning, subtle guilt. She suggested that exposing the fund would harm innocent families, that the fallout would follow Mila too. It was a warning disguised as concern, but its meaning was unmistakable. Their legacy mattered more to them than their granddaughter's dignity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't correct them. I didn't argue. I simply told them they needed to leave. For the first time since I was a teenager, neither pushed back. My father held my gaze for a long moment, searching for the fear he expected to see. When he didn't find it, he gathered the folder, straightened his coat, and walked out. Elaine paused at the door as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. The silence spoke loud enough. After they left, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the steady rhythm of Mila's breathing. The confrontation hadn't changed anything. It had only confirmed what was already true. The version of family my parents wanted to display was built on borrowed virtue and broken trust. And for the first time, I understood with absolute clarity that there was no place for us within it. The next morning unfolded with a stillness that felt different from the day before. It wasn't calm exactly, but something inside me had settled into place. Mila ate her breakfast quietly, swinging her feet beneath the table while I packed our suitcases. She didn't ask about my parents or the engagement party, and I didn't bring it up. There was nothing left to explain. The truth had already spoken for itself. I checked us out of the hotel before the lobby grew busy and loaded our bags into the rental car. The sun was only beginning to rise when we left Tulsa, painting faint colors across the sky as the highway stretched ahead. Mila hummed softly beside me, tracing shapes on the window with her fingertip. Each mile between us and my parents loosened something I hadn't realized had been clenched for years. By the time we crossed into Colorado, Riley had sent another message. The compliance officer confirmed irregularities within the scholarship fund and prepared a formal report for the board. She assured me the findings would move forward regardless of my involvement, and that anonymity would be protected. Reading her words didn't bring satisfaction. It brought clarity. Whatever happened next was no longer mine to manage. It belonged to the truth itself. We arrived back in Denver just after noon. Mila rushed inside ahead of me, eager to return to the familiarity of her room and the small collection of paper crafts she'd left on her desk. I stood in the doorway for a moment, breathing in the quiet comfort of our home. It wasn't grand, it wasn't impressive, but it was ours, built without conditions, without performance, without anyone deciding whether we belonged. Later that week, news spread through the community in Tulsa. The board suspended my father from his leadership role pending investigation. Donors requested transparency. Volunteers resigned. My mother attempted to salvage the family's image by releasing a carefully worded statement about administrative misunderstandings, but the truth had already circulated far beyond her reach. They lost their positions, their influence, and the curated pedestal they had climbed for so long. None of it surprised me. When a house is built on stolen beams, collapse isn't a tragedy, it's gravity. They didn't contact me again. Not to apologize, not to explain, not to repair what had been broken long before the fund was ever created. Their silence didn't wound me. It confirmed what I'd known deep down for years. Acceptance had never been part of their definition of family. Life in Denver moved forward without interruption. I took on new projects and signed contracts that allowed me to expand my business. Mila returned to school with a brightness I hadn't seen in months, proudly wearing a small charm bracelet she had made during art class. Some nights she asked simple questions, whether we would visit Tulsa again, whether family always stayed the same, whether grown-ups ever changed. I answered gently each time, choosing honesty without bitterness. One evening, while we baked cookies together, she looked up at me with flour dusting her cheeks and said she liked our life just the way it was. Hearing that softened something inside me that had been rigid for too long. I realized then that walking away hadn't been an ending. It had been the first step toward the kind of family I wanted her to grow up knowing, one defined by safety, not obligation, and shaped by love, not performance. I thought about all the years I spent trying to be included in photographs where I was never truly seen. I thought about the version of myself that used to shrink to fit whatever space my parents left available. And I thought about how easily a child can believe exclusion is normal when adults refuse to call it what it is. The lesson wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady and simple. Belonging should never be begged for, and family is not measured by blood, wealth, or legacy. It's measured by the people who choose you without hesitation, and the ones you choose in return. If you've listened this far, thank you for staying with me through something I carried for far too long. And before you go, tell me, what city are you listening from, and what did this story make you think about? I'm genuinely curious how far it will travel and what it might mean to someone else.